Hello everyone, this is a video tutorial on how to use materials for the Unreal Engine. I'm using version 5.1 currently, and this is meant for a little bit of moderate users to a little bit of beginners. So a little bit of a mixture in between and some of the practical uses. So there's a lot of videos out there that kind of cover a few things, but I'm looking more for the practical applications of it. So here we are in our Unreal Engine right now. And in the background here, you can see one of the rock structures out here, which is something that was modified to fit. And that's kind of what we're going to look at first here. So here we have an example of an asset that I have put into the game world here. And this doesn't really match exactly to the background. So what we're going to look at is what can we do to correct this to maybe make it blend in a little more or to change it. So if you have maybe a limestone rock, you want it to be granite, it's a very easy process to do that. So on here, what we have is different rock that maybe blends in a little more because the color of this matches a little bit. And it also gives us multiple options. So now we have two completely different objects here using the same mesh, but just using different materials to get a very different outcome. So if we look at the first one here, you can use Control E to open this up and say, well, what is this actually composed of? So on here, this is made up of this material on here, or this fire on here. This is an Epic game content file that I got directly from them. It's free on there. So on there, I'm going to bring this down a little bit, and we're going to look at, that is the material fire right here. So that is this right here. And this is a very simple material that only has just a couple components here. This is one of the things that when you first get into using Unreal, it's a little bit difficult to work with materials and the understanding of this because there's a lot of new terminology to look at, a lot of different options, and you can really go far into this, into adding, gloss and animations and scanning and stuff like that. But there's really only two main things that you need to know on here, and that is the normal and the base color. The normal is kind of your height map, which when you think about where these actually come from, you're taking a 3D object and you're breaking it down maybe from a different system and bringing it into Unreal. You're basically taking that 3D object and crunching it down into a couple of files, which is what this is doing. And then you're kind of reversing that process. So the normal on here is important because it has all of the height texturing on this object and really how it's supposed to be. So what we want to do in changing this is we want to use that same height map on here. So the normal is going to stay the same. And really the only thing that we're going to change is the base color. You might see this as diffuse or some other things as well. But that's basically what's being used. So this texture right here, so if we click on it, this is the texture that's being used now. That's what's creating the current look of this one. So on here, we open that up again, that's Control E. When you select it, this is using MRock High. So if we open that up, M High on here, this is the material that it's using. So it's just using a different texture. And when I went through and I was doing this, all that I did was go through and opened up the outliner here and used its control space to open up your files. And I just put in texture on here, or rock or something like that. And then it's giving me all the different rocks that are in here. You notice a lot of these are not texture, they're actual rocks and static meshes and things like that. But I went through and just looked for a texture that would blend more into the landscape. So you can pretty much go through all of your content. You can also go to Bridge and download textures and stuff like that. So it doesn't really matter where you get it, but basically I went through and just found a different texture to apply here and just drag and drop that into here and created that as my texture. And now I have a completely different object. And when you do that, if we open this up, what you'd want to do, sorry, I'll use Control V for that. You can just duplicate this and then change the texture onto a new one. So right click on there, go to duplicate. Now you have another object of it. Then you change the one that you created and change that material on there. So we're going to take another look at it, another example here at some of the tiling. And there's two main ways to do tiling on here. If you look at the tile on here, this all looks about the same consistency as far as the tile density on here. But there's a couple tricks to really make that happen and a couple different ways to do that. If we look at this object, so I've selected it, I'm in selection mode here, and I'll just click on it, and then Control E will open it up. Well, what is this comprised of? Well, this material is using M Flagstone 1, which I already have open here. So it's basically just this simple example. It's using that base again into normal, and it is using a couple other things for the roughness of it. But the main important thing on here is this is the tiling on here. So if you right click and do a landscape coordinate, landscape, what did I have here? Landscape. Layer coordinate, sorry about that. Okay, so this will basically give you the details of the tiling on it, which if you look on here by default, we kind of have this scaling and a few things on here. But if you add a multiplier on it here, like this, and put it into the UV, you'll basically get the tiling density, which is what this is here. So this is the example that I have here of putting the multiplier on that. And then on here, if you right click on this and do promote to variable or promote to parameter, you'll end up with this parameter on here. And the reason for that is for in a material instance, you can then change it. We'll take a look at that in a second, how you can manipulate that and kind of change it. But what does that mean exactly? Because a lot of people kind of explain this stuff, but it's kind of, what is the practical use and what is that actually doing? Well, when we go back and look at it, we say, okay, these tiles kind of look like they're the same, but this object and this object are kind of completely different on the tiling. So if we open up this one, we notice this is actually using Flagstone 2 on here, which is up here in this tab. And this is what I meant about that material instance. So this one is actually using a material instance and not the material. So it's kind of just using an instance of that material on here to kind of create a new one. And you'll notice here it says 0.2. Well, why is this 0.2 instead of 1 like the other one? Well, the reason is because the size of this object is much smaller than this. So if we go back and change this to 1, now they both have the same. But if we zoom in here, take a quick look at this, the tiling on this is now completely different. These are still the larger tiles, and these are all small. They don't seem to match up quite as well. If you kind of go through here, you've got these little small tiles in this. That's because if we look at this object, it's much larger. And the tiling is the same, but because this object is so small, the tile density is affecting that. So that's why material instance in this case was used. And it was shrunken down. So if we go back to the material instance, as we change this, you can just kind of test it out and see. So what does 0.5 look like? You see that it's updating it in real time here. And if we go back to 0.2, we get a texture that matches a little bit better to what the other tiles are. So that's kind of just a way of using that tiling density to kind of control and also make things match up a little bit better. And I talked about a secondary way of doing that as well. So we're going to look at another example. So we're going to take a quick little trip through the game world here. And we are going to fly right through the floor because there's an underground section to this as well. So when we start looking in the underground area, we have another example here of some materials and tiling. And if we look at this wall, we have a certain tile texture and size for it. And if we look at this wall, we have the same thing on here on both of these, but it's using a different method. Now you see that this back wall is also much larger than this, but why is the tiling exactly the same on this if they're using the same density? So let's take a look. So when we open this up, we see this is using this material rough granite on here, which is open here. And this one's set up a little bit differently. This is using some 2D textures instead. So that's why I set up these 3 example textures on here, because there's one thing that you need to do, which is a conversion on here. So if you click on these 3 and then right click on it, you can do convert to texture object. So now we get the ones that are actually being used on here. And then we also have a world aligned texture. World aligned texture. So if we take that, connect the node, and then send that directly to the base color, that's kind of what we're getting here. This is doing a little bit different tiling method. When you do it this way, any object that you create is automatically going to have the same tiling density applied to it. That way, if you're creating something like this, where your walls are different sizes, or you're painting on different materials and stuff like that, everything will match up a little bit better. So I think it's kind of a helpful way to kind of, make a decision on what you want to do. And you also notice like the floor here is kind of doing the same thing. So this floor is just constructed the same way, and then all the floors and that kind of look the same way. So that's all that I'm going to use for this tutorial. And in one of the future ones, we may take a look at the example of this object right here and how it's created, because this one was kind of cropped up and it looked very differently as the asset I originally had. I chopped off the top of it, put an extra little tiling on top, which you can kind of see here. So this is actually what it looks like when we cut across it. It left some, kind of damage on there because this really wasn't meant to be done. But that's why we made this kind of little coating for it and made this. So kind of created an object that we want, and that'll be in one of the future videos. So that's all I have right now for the material instance. I hope that kind of helped everyone out, and probably providing some more tutorials, and also you can kind of see a little bit of the game development as it goes as well. Thank you very much.